Hello, my name's Hannah and I work on the clinical safety team at NHS Digital, and I'm here to welcome you to our Clinical Risk Management Foundation course. We've been delivering this training for many years now, and we're constantly monitoring and evaluating the feedback that we receive in order to make sure that the content that we deliver and the way in which we deliver it is as beneficial and relevant to our delegates as it can possibly be. At the start of the coronavirus pandemic, we shifted all of our training delivery into the realms of remote learning and began to offer the one-day course in a virtual environment. And whilst this allows many benefits in terms of access and logistics, it also brings its own challenges, and we've spent the last 12 months figuring out how we're going to overcome these based on the feedback that we've received from our previous delegates. The one thing that stood out to us was the difficulty that some delegates faced when trying to stay focused on the material being presented throughout a full day course. There's a lot of information to take in, and we were often told that whilst the content was relevant and interesting, it was just too difficult to take in when you've been sat in front of the computer all day trying to remain focused. We did build in additional breaks throughout the day, but the feedback remained the same, which is why we made the decision to get the clinical safety team together to pre-record these modules for you. By now, you should have done the e-learning and have a basic understanding of the principles of clinical risk management, and now you'll have access to 9 of the modules from the virtual course prior to attending. It's important that you watch these modules in order. All of the modules have one of our team narrating the slides, so you get exactly the same experience as if you were attending the virtual session, with the added bonus that you can stop and start as you wish. Then, when you do attend the virtual session, we'll recap the module that you've already watched and then do some workshops and facilitate a discussion and question session. If you have any questions while watching the modules, please bring those with you to your virtual session and we can address them on the day. Alternatively, you can send your questions to clinicalsafety.training@nhs.net. This means that the virtual session that you attend will be shorter and more discussion focused, which we hope will improve your learning experience and ensure that you get the best value for money. So thank you for attending the course. We really hope that you enjoy it.
Hello, I'm Ian and I'm going to be taking you through Module 2, Safety Standards. This module looks at the safety standards, and the aim of the module is to help you understand the purpose and status of the clinical risk management standards, the scope of the clinical risk management standards, and the role of a clinical safety officer. So by the end of the module, I hope you will have an understanding of the purpose, status, structure and scope of the safety standards, along with the responsibilities and requirements for a clinical safety officer. The 2 standards which will be discussed during this course are DCB 0129 and DCB 0160. The purpose of the standards is to ensure effective clinical risk management is carried out by organisations, to help establish best practice and enable organisations to plan and follow a symptomatic and consistent approach to clinical risk management, and also to ensure the extent of clinical risk management is proportionate to the scale, complexity and level of clinical risk associated with the health IT system. DCB 0129 is aimed at organisations that are responsible for manufacturing, developing and modifying health and social care IT systems. DCB 0160 is aimed at their customers or health and social care organisations that are procuring, implementing, deploying or decommissioning those systems. The standards have been refined over the years as they have evolved and are very straightforward and remarkably easy to read. Each standard consists of 2 documents: a specification, which describes what must be done to comply with the standard, and implementation guidance. This document provides guidance to support the interpretation of the requirements. Both standards apply to any publicly funded health or social care work that is delivered in England and demonstrate the responsibilities of an organisation and where that responsibility lies within the organisation. The standards use the terms must or should. Must demonstrates an absolute requirement of the standard, and should demonstrates a requirement which is recommended if applicable, but is not mandatory. However, the full implications must be understood and carefully assessed before following this path. The two standards side by side are very similar. The major difference is that a requirement in DCB 0160, the standard which applies to organisations that are procuring or implementing health and social care IT systems which support patient or service user care, states they must ensure any supplier they use complies with DCB 0129. The 0129 and 0160 standards have been effective since 2009 and were derived from ISO 14971. These standards have retained the numbers 0129 and 0160 in whatever guise the prefix has been. DCB stands for Data Coordination Board. They are the organisation who own the standards. Prior to being DCB standards, they were SCI standards, SCI being the Standardisation Committee for Care Information, and prior to that they were ISB, Information Standards Board standards. The DCB 0129 and DCB 0160 standards are mandated in England. They were published under Section 250 of the Health and Social Care Act 2012. The Act states that publicly funded bodies in health and social care in England are obliged to follow information standards. These standards have been informally adopted in the devolved authorities, and NHS Digital has provided training in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and also internationally, as the health IT community has seen these standards as best practice. To summarise, DCB 0129 and DCB 0160 must be followed where the provision or use of information has the potential to cause harm to patients or service users, and apply to any publicly funded health or social care work that is delivered in England. Unlike the MHRA, who are the regulator for the Medical Device Directive and Medical Device Regulations, NHS Digital is not a regulatory body. The responsibility for compliance with the safety standards lies with individual organisations. To help ensure compliance, NHS Digital can provide some audit provision should that be contracted. A compliance assessment tool which accompanies the standards is available on NHS Digital website. Some links will be provided later in this module which will take you to the NHS Digital web pages where this tool can be found. The tool is in the form of an Excel spreadsheet and asks if your organisation is compliant or non-compliant with each requirement of the standard. Production of a clinical safety case report does not prove compliance to the standards. The clinical safety case report is a key piece of evidence. However, it is worth noting that the standards also contain management and product requirements. The standards apply to all health IT systems which could potentially cause harm to patients. Of course, the technical aspects, such as failures of the health IT system, need to be considered, but it is also important to consider the human factors involved in interacting with those systems, such as incorrect use, interaction, and information errors. Some health IT systems may also be classed by the MHRA as a medical device. The DCB standards were amended in June 2018 to clearly state that a system registered as a medical device must also comply with the DCB standards. Outside the scope of the DCB standards, are security and information governance. There's an obvious need to be mindful of the potential impact of security and IG issues. However, the management and control of these should be done through different processes. Some IG risks may have a clinical safety impact. When we talk about harm to patients, we need to consider not only physical harm, but also the psychological harm which could occur through IG incidents. But the management of IG risks should be done separately. Harm to patients through malicious use is out of scope. This is not something which the IT system can be responsible for. Also out of scope are financial reporting tools and any statistical reporting tools which may be included in the health IT system, as they would not have a direct impact on patient safety. The standards can be broken down into 3 different sections. On the right hand side of this diagram, you can see the different elements of the standard which apply to each section. So, defining the scope, identifying the hazards, and estimating the risk can be described as risk analysis. We then have initial risk evaluation. Risk evaluation involves evaluating whether the clinical risk is acceptable. This evaluation must use the risk acceptability criteria defined in the Clinical Risk Management Plan. The third section covers risk control and looks at how controls are implemented and whether they are complete. This section also includes the potential of carrying out a risk-benefit analysis, which will be covered later in the course. This example is taken from DCB 0129, and as can be seen, this standard also goes on to cover delivery of the system, post-deployment monitoring, and any modifications that might be introduced into the system. DCB 0129 and DCB 0160 can be found on the NHS Digital website. The links displayed on this slide will take you to the relevant standard. The structure of the standards is demonstrated on this slide. The specification is concise and written in plain English and describes what must be done to comply with the standard. The implementation guidance expands on each requirement, providing guidance to support the interpretation of the requirements, and is a useful guide to help provide more clarity. It also gives some example templates and risk matrices that you may wish to use, although these are not mandated. Additional guidance is also available. Links to where this can be found are on the next slide. The compliance assessment tool was discussed earlier in this module. A link to where it can be found is displayed here. Other additional guidance covering subjects such as middleware, mobile and telehealth solutions, and agile developments can be found on the displayed links. The purpose of the standards is to promote effective clinical risk management and ensure that effective clinical risk management is carried out by organisations who are either responsible for developing and modifying health IT systems or organisations that are responsible for deploying, using, maintaining or decommissioning health IT systems within the NHS. The standards define clinical risk management as the systematic application of management policies, procedures and practices to the tasks of analysing, evaluating and controlling clinical risk. So, clinical risk management can reduce the potential for design flaws or user errors which result in patient harm. By following a systematic process, we can identify potential hazards earlier in the life cycle and establish what controls are in place or in need of improvement or strengthening. Safety incidents need effective management, So being prepared for incidents prior to go live and being able to manage incidents post go live is an important consideration. The standards also state that knowledgeable and experienced people are needed to manage the process effectively. It states in the standards that organisations must nominate a clinical safety officer and that the clinical safety officer must be a suitably qualified and experienced clinician. The standards apply to health and social care, so a clinician could have a medical, nursing or midwifery background. They could be an allied health professional, a pharmacist or dentist. As the standards also apply to social care, the clinician could also be a registered social worker. The clinician must be registered with their appropriate professional body. So examples being the General Medical Council, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the Health and Care Professions Council, the General Pharmaceutical Council, or the General Dental Council. A clinical safety officer must be knowledgeable in clinical risk management and how it can be applied in clinical domains. This course is one example of how that knowledge can be gained, but it is recognised in the standards that there are other methods to acquire the relevant skills and justify their ability to fulfil the role of a clinical safety officer. Some of the responsibilities of a clinical safety officer are approving the clinical risk management plan, ensuring that clinical risk management activities are complete, the review and approval of all safety documentation, and providing a recommendation regarding whether the health IT system is safe to release. That's the end of this module. The key learning objectives were to understand the purpose and status of the clinical risk management standards, the scope of the clinical risk management standards, and the role of a clinical safety officer. I hope this module has helped you gain an understanding of these. The next module looks at clinical risk management process.
Hi there, my name's Hannah. I'm going to be talking you through Module 3, which is the clinical risk management process. The aim of this module is to give you a deeper understanding of the clinical risk management process. By the end of this module, I hope that you'll have learned what activities need to be undertaken as part of this process, and also what deliverables the standards require that you produce to ensure that the process has been successfully followed. Once you understand the process, you'll be able to apply your learning on this module during the practical session at your designated virtual course. The clinical risk management process is similar to any other management process. There's a sequence of activities to be undertaken and a set of documents to be produced. Having this process in place ensures that the work is done in the same way across the organisation, regardless of when or by whom it's carried out. This makes it systematic and repeatable and consistent. There are both proactive and reactive elements to the process. The proactive approach is about considering what could go wrong and trying to preempt any potential hazards. By anticipating what could go wrong, you can be proactive about stopping it. The aim of proactive risk management is to either completely prevent the hazard from occurring or at least reduce the likelihood of the hazard occurring. The reactive approach is to ensure that if a hazard does occur, that action can be taken before a patient comes to harm. This means that the organisation must have measures in place for responding to incidents that are reported in a live environment and are taking the correct steps to resolve them in good time. Whilst the organisation must prepare both approaches as part of the process, it's the proactive approach that carries the most weight. It's far more effective to try and prevent a hazard from occurring in the first place than to apply remedial action once it does. For example, it's much better to brush and floss your teeth daily to avoid tooth decay rather than having to have a filling once the damage has occurred. However, both proactive and reactive risk management play an important part through the clinical risk management process. The clinical risk management process is broadly broken down into 4 key questions. What could go wrong? If it did go wrong, how serious would it be? How likely is it that the patient could come to that level of harm? And what can we do about it? It's important to remember the concept of credibility, and when we talk about things going wrong, remember to stick to scenarios that are both plausible and realistic. This is what we mean when we talk in later modules about identifying credible hazards. So firstly, we must identify what could credibly occur that might cause harm, establish whether it could credibly result in harm, and how severe the harm would be to the patient. Establish how likely it is that the harm will occur. Can you define it? Is it 1 in 100 patients? Is it every month, every year? Remember, when you're asking yourself how likely is it, you're not asking how likely is it that the hazard would occur. You're asking yourself, how likely is it that the hazard occurs and the patient comes to the level of harm that you've previously identified? Once you have this information, you can decide if this level of risk is acceptable or not. Where you've decided that it's not, then you need to ask yourself what can be done about it. What controls must be put in place to reduce either the chance of the hazard occurring, these would be your preemptive controls, or to reduce the chance of the patient coming to harm if it did occur, and these are your reactive controls. And these questions can be broadly mapped into the 3 key phases of clinical risk management: analysis, evaluation, and control, all of which you'll learn more about as you go through the course. There are 4 activities that make up the clinical risk management process, and these are performed in sequential order. The first is hazard identification. This is the part of the process where key people interrogate the system in the context of the patient care pathway and try to identify potential for failure. What might go wrong? What if this were to happen? What if someone is able or unable to perform a certain action? What does this mean for the user, and could it impact the patient? A hazard must relate to the patient. One important thing to remember, and it's something that you'll explore in much greater detail later on, is that technology in itself cannot be a hazard. It's what someone can or cannot do with the data the technology provides that has the potential for harm. The hazard will always sit in the people space. If the hazard you've identified isn't directly relatable to the patient, then it isn't a hazard. It's more likely that what you've identified is the cause of a hazard. But again, this is covered in much greater detail during Module 5. The second activity is risk analysis. Once you've got your list of hazards, these can then be analysed and more detail added. What might cause the hazard to occur? What would happen if it did occur? How serious would it be for the patient? And how likely is it that that seriousness would be realised? Using a defined risk matrix, you should give your hazard a score based on the severity of the harm and the likelihood of that harm being achieved. Justify your reasoning. Explain why you've decided on that level of harm and likelihood. Clinical judgment is a very important part of the risk analysis phase. Next is the time for risk evaluation. You should have a defined acceptance criteria in place. This gives clear direction for what level of risk is considered acceptable within your organisation. Look at the scores you've given your hazards. Do they fall within the acceptable or unacceptable levels? Decide if you need to take further actions. Justify your decisions and provide risk-benefit analysis where needed. Finally comes risk control. If you've decided that your risk is too high, what are you going to do about it? What action can you take, either preemptive or reactive, to reduce that level of risk? Make sure that you can evidence the success of your controls. It's important that you don't rely on controls that you won't be able to implement or sustain. But don't worry, all of these activities are discussed in greater detail over the next few modules. For now, we'll move on to the deliverables. There are a number of documents that you'll need to produce to evidence compliance with the standard. These documents are the same regardless of whether you're complying with DCB 0129 or DCB 0160. The first piece of documentation you'll need is a clinical risk management plan. The plan sets out the sequence of activities, remembering back to the previous slide, and milestones that need to be achieved. It shows what's being done and when and by who, and it's the timeline of how the process will be followed, and it identifies key resources and responsibilities. It can be part of the overarching programme or project plan. It doesn't need to be set apart. The plan should be iterative, so it starts at the beginning of the programme and is updated as required as the programme or project progresses. The second piece of documentation you'll need is a hazard log. Now, this is the outcome of the hazard assessment activity that I talked about on the previous slide. The purpose of the hazard log is to capture, record and communicate all of the information relating to the hazards that you've identified during the hazard identification activity. There are a number of ways that you can present a hazard log. It can be something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, or perhaps something more complex, whatever works for your organisation, as long as it presents the reader with all of the pertinent information gathered during the hazard identification and analysis. The information gathered in the hazard log will be used to compile the contents of the clinical safety case report, which is the third piece of documentation you'll need to produce. The clinical safety case report is issued at key points of the programme lifecycle, and it gives an update of the safety characteristics of the system. It's a snapshot in time that describes the risk profile at the point in which the report is produced. It should be read in conjunction with the hazard log and provides the reader with the additional narrative that's needed to understand the risk profile of the system. It elaborates on certain elements of the hazard log and provides the reader with additional information, such as system description and scope of deployment, testing details, and importantly, the position of the clinical safety officer and their thoughts on the overall risk being presented. Again, this is an iterative document and it's built upon as the work progresses. The final piece of documentation required by the standard is the Safety Incident Management Log. This document is similar to the hazard log, but rather than it being a list of things that might happen, this is a list of things that have happened. So whenever an incident in live operation is reported by a user, it must be assessed for safety impact to a patient. Where a safety impact is identified, the details of the incident must be recorded within the Safety Incident Management Log, along with other key details that you'll learn about in Module 11. Again, this can be part of the wider programme or organisation incident management tool, but if it is, then you'll need to be able to identify which of the incidents recorded are safety impacting. That's all for this module. The key learning objectives were to understand what activities need to be undertaken and what documentation needs to be produced in order to follow the clinical risk management process. I hope you've got a better high-level understanding of these now, as the rest of the course goes into the activities and documentation in more detail. You'll then be able to apply this learning as part of a group workshop at your designated virtual course. The next module you'll learn about is risk analysis.
Hi there, my name's Dr. Sebastian Alexander. I'm a member of the clinical safety team and I'll be taking you through this next module on risk analysis. By the end of this module, you'll understand 3 key activities of risk analysis and also the concepts of harm severity and likelihood and how they inform your decision making, and also a brief section on how to organise and run a hazard workshop. So, risk analysis, what is it? There are 3 key activities in risk analysis. Firstly, it's important to establish the scope of the project. Without doing this, it would be impossible to do anything else. Defining the boundary correctly will limit the extent of the analysis, as well as ensuring all areas impacted by the software release are considered. So we need to describe care or patient pathway that's being supported and identify and describe the technology that's being developed or deployed. Secondly, we need to identify foreseeable and credible hazards to patients. When identifying hazards, they need to be credible, so be realistic when describing them, and remember the hazards need to be focused on the patient. The DCB standards state this. Thirdly, when estimating the associated risk, we need to establish the hazard, causes, harm severity and likelihood, and take into account any existing controls. This will be based on clinical evaluation and judgment. We will need to be able to explain and justify the decisions we make, and we must be able to convince others that our decisions are correct by this explanation. This is best achieved by a multidisciplinary hazard workshop, as each person will have their own views and experience and expertise. Table 1 shows the severity classification. The assessment of severity takes account of the harm that might be experienced by patients. In our risk analysis, we will need to consider the severity classification. This example of severity classification is taken from the DCB standards. These definitions are not mandated and don't have to be used, but it's important to note that because the risk assessments are subjective and based on experience and knowledge rather than any trend or numerical data, the description of the terms used is qualitative. The classification shown here, as you can see, deals not only with physical injury, but also psychological trauma, and also distinguishes between harm to single and multiple patients. We also need to consider the likelihood classification. Table 2 shows the DCB standards for each likelihood category. Each likelihood category should have an associated meaning. These meanings should support the likelihood assessment made for each hazard. The provision of meanings will allow consistency when assessing each hazard. As you can see, likelihood is also subject to judgment on a qualitative scale. Please note that the likelihood is the likelihood of the harm occurring to the patient. Table 3 shows a risk rating matrix. This is taken from the DCB standards. Clinical risk is defined as the combination of severity of harm to a patient and the likelihood of recurrence of that harm. A two-dimensional clinical risk matrix, such as the one shown here, can be used to combine likelihood and severity to produce a measure of risk. The resulting risk rating can be used to inform decision-making regarding whether a system is acceptably safe or whether additional control measures are needed. As you can see, the risk rating matrix is color-coded, and again, this risk rating matrix is not mandated, but is in a suggested format. There are many suppliers who use different risk rating matrices. When planning a hazard assessment workshop, ideally, like all meetings, these should be face-to-face. There are many different risk assessment techniques you can use, and we'll be looking at this later on in the course. Earlier, we looked at an example of a risk rating matrix. Definitions will need to be determined for the risk rating matrix being used, i.e. what ratings would be considered acceptable and what ratings would be considered unacceptable. We need to ensure that the care pathway and health IT functionality is clearly defined and understandable. If necessary, we could do this using different process maps or graphical models. It's really important to gather any existing information on hazards and control information prior to the workshop. Similar work may have been done in the past and provide a useful source of information. And finally, it's important to give people plenty of notice. It's important that everybody can attend, otherwise key information or opinion could easily be missed. So, who should attend a workshop? A multidisciplinary team must be established with the appropriate right knowledge and experience. This slide gives some examples, but is no means definitive or complete. The meeting will need a chair to run the workshop and also to ensure that it remains focused. A minute or note taker to record and document the work done and any actions is always useful. As previously mentioned, it's really important that a team with the appropriate knowledge and experience is assembled, and of course, the attendance needs to be proportionate to the size of the program and risk profile. This is a sample agenda for a hazard assessment workshop for a knee prescribing system. As you can see, it includes welcome and introductions, purpose and scope. It's really important to remember to conclude the workshop by documenting and agreeing the hazards and by reviewing the hazard log. and also organising any follow-up meeting if this is needed. Finally, don't forget to review the meeting outcomes, discuss recommendations with the relevant people, and agree an action plan. Also allocate responsibility for the implementation of the risk reduction measures and specify the deadlines. Any agreed actions should be entered on the organisation's risk register or equivalent. This ends Module 4. The learning objectives were as follows: to understand the key activities of risk analysis, to understand the concepts of harm severity and likelihood and how they inform decision making, and then how to organise and run a hazard workshop. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sean. In this module, we're going to focus on hazards, how we can describe them and how we can identify them. So specifically, we're going to explore the concept of a hazard and what a hazard represents when we deal with clinical risk management of health IT systems. We're going to look at a process through which we can construct meaningful patient-centric hazard descriptions, and we're going to apply a particular technique that will help us to identify hazards. One of the first and key requirements in our standard is the need to define the scope of our environment. We need to explain what the system does and how it does it, but importantly, how it supports the care pathway. If we can't do these two things, then it's difficult to make a claim that we've identified all hazard causes, and it's similarly difficult to make a claim that we've captured all credible patient harm outcomes. We've got to remember when we do our analysis and we think about the scope of our system, we think about the patient at all times. So when we come to define our hazards, we can look at the standards. The standards will give us a definition. Those definitions relate to a hazard being a potential source of harm. And in the scope of our DCBs, we're thinking about harm that could occur to a patient. So we're not necessarily considering environmental harm, for example, or harms to our organisation. We think about those credible harm outcomes that occur to patients that are being managed through our care processes. Hazards are not always easy to express, and when we think about hazards and we think about our health IT systems, we've got to recognise that really we're thinking about a much bigger and broader socio-technical system, and this term of health informatics has been established to describe that. So when we talk about health informatics, we're really talking about this intersection here between technology that manifests itself in our health IT system, the information that's created by that technology, and how that information is used by people to inform their decision making and their subsequent care activities. So this model here just expresses the relationship between these three key elements of our socio-technical system. We have our technology context. So often our technology is quite complex. We have systems that are integrated together, interdependent on one another. Those systems in turn will be broken down into smaller subsystems in which we'll find software and hardware components. In essence, though, the systems are creating data, and that data becomes information when it's used in a particular context. The information in turn influences the decisions that care practitioners make and the subsequent actions that they take. So, thinking about our standards and the definitions in the standards, and thinking about our socio-technical model, we can start to establish some rules that will help us when we define hazards. So the standards give a definition of harm, and harm is that what occurs to people. Similarly, the standards give us a definition of a hazard. So a hazard really is a condition or an event from which harm could credibly occur. So harm occurs in the context of people. Information in itself can't cause direct harm, but clearly misinformation, late information, wrong information can have an effect on the decisions that we make and the actions that we subsequently take. So they can effectively disrupt the intended care pathway, cause us to do something different from what we should be doing. Technology can't cause direct harm. Things like electric shock fall outside of the scope of our standards. So technology isn't directly interfacing with the person, but clearly if it fails, if there's a flaw in it, if it's misused, it can influence information and so be a cause of a hazard. So we've been able to establish 4 key concepts here. We have a cause, an initiating thing that occurs that has an effect or can have an effect in our care process, i.e. disrupt it, cause a deviation. Analysis of that deviation could identify a particular hazard or hazards, which in turn could credibly result in patient-level harm. So now we've started to build a framework that we can use to describe hazards. We've got this sequential relationship between these 4 key concepts. We've got cause, propagating into an effect, a disturbance within our care pathway. That disturbance, that deviation, perhaps could lead to an event or condition from which harm could occur. So we can now start to articulate these 4 key concepts. So we can apply our framework to our original technology, information, people model to understand the context in which these 4 key constructs exist. So causes occur in the context of technology, if it fails or whether there's an inherent flaw in that technology. But importantly, they also occur in the context of people. So people can be induced to do the wrong thing. Effects exist in the context of information. So misinformation, malformed information, incorrect information can cause an effect in the care pathway, cause a deviation in the care pathway. Hazards exist in the context of people where they use that misinformation to inform the decisions and their subsequent care activities. Harm, as we know by definition in the standards, exists in the context of people. So if a particular hazard was to propagate, it's credible that harm could result. So it's important to remember that causes are not necessarily failures. We often think from a negative viewpoint when we're doing clinical risk analysis, but causes can be doing the right thing but in the wrong context. We also must remember that people can be causes. Again, they may not necessarily need to be doing the wrong thing, but they can do the right thing and propagate the problem. I shall explain this through this simple care pathway. So the box outside an icon represents whether the right thing is being done, i.e. a green box, or whether the wrong thing is being done, i.e. a red box. The colour of the icon itself represents whether it's a cause, whether it's an effect, whether it's a hazard, or whether it's a harm. So this is a simple model of prescribing in intensive care unit. So the consultants will triage the patient, assess their clinical need, and invariably create a prescription to manage that clinical need. So they're doing the right thing and are initiating a chain of care activities. The intended prescription is then committed to the electronic prescribing system. However, we've got a flaw within this electronic prescribing system in that it mismaps drugs. So the intended prescription has been mapped to a different medicine type. We now have an effect in our care process in that the prescription that is being managed represents something that wasn't intended. The next step in the care process is for the pharmacist to receive that prescription and prepare medications in accordance with that prescription. Without knowing the original intent of the consultant, the pharmacist has no way of knowing that the prescription represents something that wasn't intended. The prescription is valid, it contains appropriate quantities, dosage instructions, so the pharmacist completes their work activities correctly, but in doing so propagates this effect through the care pathway. The next activity in the care pathway is the first nursing check. So again, without any understanding of the original prescribing intent, the nurse checks that the medications match the prescription and the prescription is valid and legal. Similar to the pharmacist, they're doing the right work, but in the context of a disruption within the care process, i.e. Unintended prescription. This effect propagates to the next work activity where the problem becomes a potential hazard. The nurse has no knowledge of the prescribing intention, double checks the medication against a prescription, double checks that the first nurse have completed their quality checks. So we're now at a point in the care process where it's credible that the nurse could then administer the medication. If that were to occur, the effect propagates through to the patient and potentially creates a harm scenario if the patient was allergic to that medication or if that medication interacted with any other medication the patient was on. A harm outcome is quite credible. So how does this framework help us in practice? Well, this is a description of a hazard that was presented in a safety case, supporting the use of a system that utilises PDS in support of registering the birth of a newborn baby. The purpose of registering the birth is that it initiates a number of screening tests that would uncover any particular birth defects or conditions. Clearly, none of that is articulated in this description, and I was expected to review and approve the risk analysis that was done to support this particular hazard. But by being systematic and applying this simple framework of cause, effect, hazard and harm, we can soon record a much more structured, meaningful description of the scenario from which we can start to contemplate the subsequent risk analysis. So we've discussed the concept of a hazard. We've looked at a framework we can use to systematically develop hazard descriptions, but how do we identify the hazards in the first place? Well, there's a number of techniques we can use. Things like structured what-if technique, hazard identification, and hazardous operation all explore deviations from what is intended to occur to reveal those hazards. They're very systematic in their approach, and they're supported by particular guide words through which you can explore these deviation concerns. So what happens if I can register the baby's weight in pounds rather than kilograms, for example? Functional failure analysis and failure modes effects analysis are focusing on the functional characteristics of our system. So they look at the failure modes of the system and then contemplate, well, whether those failure modes could propagate and cause hazards. Again, very systematic in their application. They're supported by a predefined table. The only downside with these type of techniques is that they can produce a lot of output, and generally there's a lot of repetition in that output as well. The other technique is certainly the simplest. It uses a checklist to establish a number of questions and basically reflects on incidents that have occurred in similar systems and lessons that have been learnt through the development and deployment of similar systems. So quite good from a reflective point of view. What they're not very good at supporting is the development of new systems or the deployment into different care environments. So there's no right and wrong technique to apply. A lot of it comes down to what you're familiar with, what particular viewpoint you're taking of the care pathway, and what your previous experience may be in doing this type of work. SWIFT is a very popular technique. We see a lot of organisations using it to support their hazard identification activities. It's good in that it enables you to consider how people interact with the technology, how they support the care pathway. It enables you to think about organisational impact on the care pathway. And of course, it enables you to drill down and think about particular technical failures that can cause an effect in that care pathway. It's very systematic in the way it's conducted, so working from a good model of the care pathway, thinking about how the technology supports the care pathway and what the patient care management activities are, you can systematically explore how things could go wrong. It isn't something that would be conducted by an individual person. The strength, the value of using SWIFT is built on a group of people bringing their experience, their expertise, their knowledge together so that the problem domain can be explored from different perspectives. So you really do need that expert input to drive successful outcomes. There's no firm and fixed set of guide words that you must use when you conduct swift analysis. You will develop your own set of guide words through your own experience, and they'll be influenced by the viewpoint that you take when you analyze your system. So for example, if you're thinking about the information that's being presented and used within the system, you'll find that your guide words relate to those type of characteristics. Again, if you're thinking about the user experience of using the system to support the care pathway, then the guide words will become more centric around that. So we'll just run a little case study now where we can use our cause, effect, hazard and harm framework and SWIFT technique to identify a hazard and describe that hazard in a meaningful, patient-centric way. So we talked about the importance of having a model in place, a definition of what our socio-technical system looks like, and this is a very high-level model of the electronic prescription service that is used in primary care. So we can see we have a patient. That patient will interact with a GP, with a prescriber, who will triage their clinical need. Potentially, they'll create a prescription in their desktop system, which will be validated and verified and uploaded electronically to the National Prescription Service. The prescription service will then transport that electronic prescription to the nominated pharmacy, where the prescription is pulled down into the pharmacy system. When the patient presents at the pharmacy and their identity is confirmed, the pharmacist will then dispense a medication against that prescription and inform the national service that the medications have been dispensed. So this is a model of the same care pathway, but this time we're using swim lanes to identify the particular actors in the care pathway, the activities undertaken by those actors, and the relationship between those activities. It provides a good model from which we can be systematic and conduct a swift analysis to identify hazards associated with this care pathway. We know that hazard causes exist in the context of technology, so we can start looking at those first technology-related activities. So what happens if there is a flaw in our prescribing system in that it maps one drug to another? This could cause an effect in that within the dispensing system, the electronic prescription that is being retrieved doesn't reflect what was originally prescribed. So we have a disturbance in our care process now. We know that hazards exist in the context of people, so this effect that has occurred due to a flaw in our prescribing system could manifest itself at this point of medication dispensing by the pharmacist. Similarly, harm occurs in the context of people, so it's credible that if the patient subsequently took the medication and was allergic to it, or the medication interacted with any other medication they could be concurrently taking, harm could credibly occur. So from a very simple model of an end-to-end care process, we've been able to systematically apply the framework of cause, effect, hazard and harm, and reveal a hazard using structured what-if technique. So we can capture this in a table to document our structured what-if activity. By using cause, effect, hazard and harm, we can start to construct a meaningful patient-centric hazard description. In practice, when we do our subsequent analysis, we would drill down into more detail. So how could the system corrupt the intended prescription? And as the work evolves, we'll see more detail being identified around this high-level cause. But it provides a clear, concise, patient-centric description of the scenario at the start of the clinical risk management process. So the standards establish a requirement for a hazard log, and a hazard log
Hi, I'm Andy Carr, I'm a Clinical Safety Officer, and I'd like to explore with you risk estimation using bow tie analysis. The aim of this module is to understand the importance of explaining and justifying the causal relationship. Also, how to estimate the scale of hazard risk and how use of the bow tie analysis can facilitate that risk estimation. Risk estimation involves establishing the sequence of causes that can lead to a hazard which ultimately may result in harm. It is very rare that harm will result from a single cause. Often, a combination of potentially unrelated causes can result in effects on the care pathway that ultimately may result in harm. As part of the process of risk estimation, it is important to also consider any existing controls that may be in place. And risk estimation involves both looking at the severity of harm, but importantly also how likely that severity of harm could be. When doing risk estimation, visualizing James Reason's Swiss cheese model can often be useful in doing the risk estimation process. The Swiss cheese model helps to illustrate the relationship between a cause or causes, the hazard, and ultimately harm. What it also does is it illustrates how controls may be in place or may be introduced in order to provide mitigation. However, it does also clearly illustrate the fact that nothing's ever perfect and controls may be in place, but controls may not always be 100% effective. Sometimes controls can fail, the potentiation of the risk is still there, and ultimately those causes may pass through holes or faults or failures within those controls. The hazard may still be encountered, and failure of further controls may ultimately result in harm. There are two phases of risk analysis: initial risk analysis and residual risk analysis. Initial risk analysis considers the state before any new or additional controls are introduced. It considers any existing controls that may already be in place and those that will remain effective following the introduction of the change. For example, following the introduction of a new prescribing system, the controls that provided by the pharmacy staff providing checks may still be in place and they will still be effective. Residual risk analysis takes place and considers any additional controls that have been introduced where further mitigation of risk has been deemed necessary. Residual risk analysis will consider the combined effect of both the existing controls and those additional controls that have been introduced. An example of an additional control could be the use and introduction of common coding standards. For example, here, use of the nationally recognised DM&D coding terms in relation to prescribing, which would help to eliminate or mitigate drug mapping errors. The bow tie diagram helps to graphically illustrate a hazard and its relationship to a cause or causes and harms. It's very useful when there may be multiple different causes to a hazard and potentially different types of harm outcome should that hazard be encountered. The hazard is the focal point of the analysis and as such is in the centre of the bow tie diagram. The different causes that we have illustrated here all are acting independently, but sometimes you may have causes that act alongside each other, in which case they can be shown sequentially prior to the hazard being encountered. Causes could be from a variety of different factors, for example, technical faults or failures, human error will also be a common cause. And the bow tie diagram is very useful in order to help illustrate where encountering a hazard may lead to different types of harm. The use of the bow tie diagram will help people to visualize better the situation that's being considered and tease out complex or difficult scenarios. The bow tie model can be further developed by adding in the different controls that may already exist. These can then illustrate how those controls may be effective in mitigating particular causes or may be effective in helping to prevent or mitigate different types of harm. Controls on the left-hand side of the diagram are often referred to as preemptive controls and can help prevent a hazard being encountered should the causes actually manifest. Controls on the right-hand side of the diagram are referred to as reactive controls, and they become effective when the hazard has occurred and will try and mitigate the potential for harm. So they will help reduce the likelihood of that harm. Estimating likelihood is qualitative and subjective, so a clinical explanation and justification for that estimation is really important. Use of the bow tie diagram can be really useful to help with this because it can help to illustrate where some of the causes may be sequential, reflecting that and relationship, so that the likelihood of the ultimate outcome is a multiple of the individual parts. It can also illustrate where there may be independent causes, reflecting more of an or relationship. In that case, the likelihood is more of a sum of the parts, and the most likely ones will be the ones that dominate. The bow tie diagram also helps to illustrate how the controls will act sequentially and may be in relation to specific causes. Remembering the Swiss cheese model, it should be remembered that you then require both the cause to manifest itself and failure of the control to both happen before the ultimate harm outcome might occur. When using the bow tie model, different single points of failure can help to be identified for where additional controls may need to be introduced. Controls that act in sequence can give strength in depth and help to prevent harm ultimately occurring. Estimation of harm is also qualitative and subjective, so again, the clinical explanation and justification is absolutely vital in order to justify the harm that has been described. The bow tie analysis will help to understand and to illustrate the causal relationship and the role that different controls have to play. However, it is important to remember that the controls will often have an impact on the likelihood of harm rather than the severity of harm. Going back to our EPS example from earlier, the use of the bow tie diagram has allowed the scenario to be developed. So as well as our initial technical cause of corruption of the e-prescription being one of the causes that could result in that hazard being encountered, this is further illustrated for independent causes. So independent, so the patient could be misidentified, or there may be a prescribing error by the GP, or there may be a drug mapping error, or there may be corruption of the e-prescription, and any one of those acting independently could result in the encountering of that hazard, the pharmacist dispensing the unintended medication. Each of the causes identified should then be added to the hazard log. The bow tie model can be a very useful tool to help explore and also to explain hazards which may have multiple causes and in some case multiple different harm outcomes.
Hello again, it's Hannah, and this time I'm going to be taking you through Module 7, Risk Evaluation. The aims of this module are to help you understand why and how we perform risk evaluation and to introduce the framework available to assist in this task. The ultimate aim of risk evaluation is to establish what level of risk can be accepted by your organisation. In order to do this, you need to go through a number of steps sequentially, and it's really important that you do these in order or you won't achieve a valid risk rating. The first step is to think about the severity of the harm to the patient. If the hazard occurs, how serious would it be? You should use a defined set of severities to assess against. The NHS Digital example of these definitions can be found in your pre-course handout pack. You don't have to use these definitions, but whatever you do use, make sure that it's defined. When we talk about severity of harm that could be encountered, you need to think about the worst case scenario. However, it still needs to be credible. Think of the worst case scenario that is still plausible and still realistic, as discussed in earlier modules. The important thing is that once you've decided what the severity of harm could be, that you're able to justify this using your clinical judgment. Once you've decided upon the level of severity, then you can start to consider the likelihood. How likely is it that the patient will come to the severity of harm that you've just identified? Think back to the Swiss cheese model from the last module. It's important to remember that when we talk about likelihood, we're not talking about how likely it is for the cause to manifest, or even how likely you are to encounter the hazard. You're asking yourself, how likely is it that the cause occurs and the arrow is able to pass all the way through, bypassing the controls, encountering the hazard, and continuing to cause the harm to the patient at the level that you've identified. Again, the likelihood classifications used by NHS Digital can be found in your handout slides. Once you've decided how likely it is and use your clinical judgment to justify your decision, you can plot the severity and likelihood on the defined risk matrix and extrapolate a risk rating. This rating can then be evaluated against the levels of acceptability defined by your organisation. Part of risk evaluation is deciding if the level of risk you've identified is considered acceptable. If the hazard risk rating falls below the level of acceptability, then it's considered acceptable. If the hazard has breached the level of acceptability defined by the organisation, then this indicates that additional work needs to be done to mitigate the risk and bring it to an acceptable level. You should consider the overall benefit of proceeding and weigh that against the risk. Sometimes, where a risk breaches the acceptable level, it may still be considered accepted. For example, if a hazard presents a high level of risk and even with additional mitigations in place, the level of risk is still deemed unacceptable, then your organisation may choose to accept this where the benefits outweigh the risk. In this scenario, the hazard is not considered acceptable, but accepted. Make sure any scenarios like this are backed up with justification. This is an example of an acceptability criteria used by NHS Digital. As you can see, it's broadly accepted that anything with a score of 2 or below can be considered acceptable. Anything that scores above a 2 will need some additional work. You must demonstrate what more you're doing to reduce the risk, or clearly articulate why you've chosen to accept the risk despite it being considered unacceptable, if you're not able to control the risk any further. Remember, you don't have to use the definitions or matrix that we provide, but whatever you do use, make sure that it's defined. It's really important to bear in mind that the risk matrix that you use might be different from the one a supplier or deploying organisation may use. So make sure that you can translate the severity, likelihood, rating and acceptability levels to understand what their level of risk is if they're using a different matrix to yours. We often find that most hazard logs are pretty good at identifying severity, likelihood and risk rating. However, what was often missing was the justification behind this. In order to ensure that the hazard log is comprehensive, compelling and understandable, there needs to be more narrative with regards to why you have chosen the levels that you have. This example demonstrates how you might provide additional explanation around a particular hazard. The key thing is to provide an explanation and justification so that people that haven't been involved in the analysis or evaluation process are able to pick up the hazard log and understand what's been discussed. It can also be particularly useful if personnel change within the organisation so that they can easily pick up previous work and understand the detail. The justification that you provide can be added to the hazard log, as you can see here in the end column. You don't have to go into a lot of detail here. The hazard log is supported by the clinical safety case report, which is the place to add all of the detail. You'll see here additional columns for control evidence. This is what you're going to learn more about in the next module, risk control.
Hi, my name is Mike Anderson. I'm a Senior Safety Engineer within the Clinical Safety team at NHS Digital. I'll be talking you through Module 8, which is Risk Control. The learning objectives of this module will focus on three key aspects. Firstly, an understanding of the concept of residual risk. Secondly, understanding the varying control strategies and the strengths and weaknesses of each. And then finally, understanding the differences between preemptive and reactive controls and how they influence and impact on the hazard outcome. Residual risk is defined after the effects of all controls have been considered and is therefore confirmed as the level of risk attributed to a particular health IT system at the point in which it's placed onto the market and or deployed and used. In order to evaluate residual risk correctly, you need to be able to demonstrate through appropriate justification and rationale that the control is sufficient. Is the control doing what it's supposed to do? Does it align with the hazard and its cause to help mitigate risk? You need to be able to demonstrate that the control is actually implemented. So it's not a statement to say we need to do something. It's a statement to evidence it's actually been implemented. And finally, demonstrate that it's been effective. Once controls are evidenced and accepted, the re-evaluation of severity versus likelihood will determine your overall residual risk. You would hope that through the introduction and evidence of controls, the residual risk for a particular hazard or hazards would reduce all risk down to an acceptable level. However, there are circumstances where an unacceptable level of risk remains, and that might be as a result of a care pathway to which the system is being utilised. In other words, the environment is inherently risky and it's not possible to implement further software controls to reduce the risk further. On that basis, a benefits risk justification needs to be completed, which provides the justification for the decision to proceed, either to market for a manufacturer or to deploy and use a system in the context of a health organisation. The important point to note in any meaningful risk management activity is to provide the supporting argument, the rationale for any residual risk outcome and the decisions to proceed. There are varying categories of risk control. Each carries its own level of effectiveness dependent on the environment to which it's being implemented. It's important to note that multiple controls can be considered to reduce the likelihood of a hazard outcome. This diagram helps to depict what's commonly known as the 4 T's and can be used to help determine if a control is effective. These are: terminate, to introduce a control that either alters the design, the care pathway to avoid or eliminate the risk in its entirety. This is considered the strongest control method and emphasises the importance of conducting upfront early risk assessments so that you have the opportunity to influence the design of a particular health IT system where undesired level of risk requires it. To treat, to introduce a control that strengthens the ability to avoid mistakes. This could be as simple as an alert warning or the design of a system to make it more intuitive and avoid human error. In this scenario, you are helping to reduce the likelihood of a hazard outcome. Tolerate. If the identification of a particular hazard and the initial risk assessment was recorded as acceptable and therefore manageable, or if the cost of implementing further controls outweighs the level of risk, in this scenario, the hazard in question will be accepted as tolerable. It's important that your organisation has a risk threshold to help determine what the level of risk acceptability is. And finally, transfer. The control type to transfer is attributed more so for a manufacturer in the context of training or business process. Whilst the manufacturer will have exhausted all possible avenues of risk control through design, training manuals, instructions for use, how the system is deployed and used is the responsibility of the deploying health organisation, and so the ability to evidence the need for continual training of staff, changes to local configuration, or updates to a health organisation standard operating procedures to ensure that the utilisation of a system within the boundaries of its intended use. These control examples are often the responsibility of the health organisation, and the manufacturer will often transfer such risks and their controls to the health organisation. To transfer is considered the weakest control in terms of effectiveness. So looking at the diagram, the control types from left to right and the level of effectiveness weakens as we move across. Health IT related examples for each will be discussed on the next slide. So taking the consideration of the 4 T's from the previous slide, risk control types broadly fit into 3 categories covering design, training and business process change. So considering design, ideally the identification of a new design feature or a change to a care pathway would hopefully eradicate or treat the potential for a known hazard. Again, referring back to the 4 T's that would broadly fit into this category of terminate and treat. Moving into training, through the identification of training manuals, guidance documentation, we can broadly fit this into the category of treat and or transfer. And finally, we've got business process change. Through the identification of a business process change, reviewing standard operating procedures, how a health organisation looks to utilise a particular health IT system within their care settings would fall under the category of business process change. And again, referring back to the 4 T's, this would fit into the treat and transfer from that diagram. When considering control verification, and as we've discussed on the previous slides in this module, you need to be able to verify each control. You need to be able to demonstrate through appropriate justification and rationale that the control is sufficient. Is the control doing the right thing? You need to be able to demonstrate that the control is actually implemented and that the suggested control has been designed and implemented. And finally, demonstrate that it's been effective. Is the control having the desired effect on reducing risk as expected? It's paramount to effective clinical risk management that the appropriate level of evidence is provided. This must be evidence within the safety case report and hazard log and continuously reviewed and maintained throughout its life cycle. The evidence should focus on clearly defining the design requirements, detailing the system intended use and or particular use case. Should also evidence clinical reviews. You can develop the most sophisticated systems, but if it's not fit for purpose in a clinical setting, it's not a viable solution within any health IT setting. Support evidence with clinical demos to validate the controls mentioned within the system's intended use. Evidence plans for how the testing will be completed, what activities will be performed to prove the system and its design. And finally, test results. Detail a particular test case or a script. A reference to a test report is okay, but additional information or more granularity in terms of the review, a test script, test case is vital in some instances. Again, it's very much dependent on the level of risk. In other words, the greater the risk, the greater the rigour. So back up any evidence where the level of risk requires it. Preemptive controls act to help mitigate against particular hazard cause, helping to reduce the effect on the care pathway and the hazard outcome. In other words, introducing a preemptive control helps to reduce the likelihood of a particular hazard occurring. It's important to note that controls can work in isolation, or they can be considered in a sequence to prevent or reduce the likelihood of harm. As depicted in this simple bow tie diagram, where we have a number of causes on the left, the hazard in the middle, and the harm outcome on the right, clearly you can see the connected or aligned preemptive controls to each cause in order to help mitigate and reduce the likelihood of the effect and hazard outcome. The hazard could possibly still occur, however, through identification and evidence of a preemptive control, the effect will hopefully have reduced. Reactive controls act to help mitigate against a particular hazard causing patient harm. In other words, introducing a reactive control helps to reduce the likelihood of a harm outcome in an instance where the hazard has occurred. Similarly to preemptive controls, reactive controls can work in isolation or as a sequence to reduce the likelihood of harm. It's also worth noting that reactive controls can work in a combination with preemptive controls to combat particular risk to reduce both the likelihood of a hazard and the harm outcome. Again, as depicted in this simple bow tie diagram, where we have the number of causes on the left, the hazard in the middle, and the harm on the right, clearly you can now see the introduction of connected or reactive controls to reduce the likelihood of actual harm. So in this scenario, a cause has had an effect on the care pathway and the hazard has happened. However, through the implementation of a reactive control, we have reduced the likelihood of actual harm. So taking what we've discussed from the previous slides in this module and applying it to a particular scenario and a generic hazard, which is patient takes unintended medication. Again, we have a number of generic causes on the left, which are the patient is misidentified, a prescribing error by the GP, there's a drug mapping error, or a corruption of an electronic prescription. Either one of these causes could have an effect on the care pathway, and the hazard cause could therefore occur, resulting in a harm outcome. A patient has an allergic reaction. However, through the introduction of a preemptive control, which is the pharmacy awareness and a GP check, this acts to help mitigate against the hazard causes, helping to reduce the effect on the care pathway and the hazard outcome. Noting the discussion points and the 4 T's discussed in the earlier slides, when considering effectiveness of certain control types, is the preemptive control type here sufficient? In other words, is it a strong or weak control? Noting that the control is solely reliant on human intervention and is therefore managed through training and or business process, the control type here would be categorized as a weak control. On that basis, evaluation of preemptive mitigations, further work is needed. Additional controls are necessary to mitigate the risk further. So let's consider introducing the following additional controls. For the cause the patient is misidentified, we could introduce a design feature which is always to use an NHS number as a form of identification. This should hopefully help prevent incorrect identification. For the cause, a prescribing error by the GP, improving system design, in other words, making the system more intuitive, will prevent GP errors. For the cause, there's a drug mapping error, the use of DM&D mapping tables to aid the GP in selecting the appropriate medication. And finally, for the corruption of an electronic prescription, the design and verification of message integration will help provide appropriate effectiveness that the messaging is working as intended. Each of these control types would be considered under the terminate or treat category and therefore considered as a strong effectiveness, dependent on and the health environment to which it's being utilised. But as we discussed earlier, always consider sequencing your mitigations. So whilst we've introduced a number of design features to strengthen the mitigations and preemptive activities to reduce the hazard outcome, by also introducing the human intervention of the pharmacy awareness and GP track, we're strengthening the preemptive controls to reduce the likelihood of this hazard occurring.
Hello, my name's Ian Dugdale. I'm a clinical safety engineer, and I'm going to talk you through Module 9, Clinical Safety Case and Clinical Safety Case Report. The objective of this module is to explain what makes a good quality clinical safety case and clinical safety case report. Firstly, I'll talk you through some terms that can, at first, be confusing. CRMF stands for Clinical Risk Management File. CSC stands for Clinical Safety Case, and CSCR stands for Clinical Safety Case Report. We'll explain the characteristics of a clinical safety argument and supporting evidence. And finally, I'll explain the purpose of the Clinical Safety Case Report and what information it should contain. So by the end of this module, you'll have learnt the purpose, content, and activities needed to create or review these deliverables. Okay, I'd like you to think back to e-learning. You may remember the relationship between Clinical Risk Management File, Clinical Safety Case, and Clinical Safety Case Report. To check your understanding, look at the image on the left of your screen. Can you match the labels A, B, and C with the numbered items 1, 2, and 3? I'll give you a few seconds to write down your answer. Okay, I hope you've got your answer. Looking at the list 1 to 3. Number 1, the Clinical Risk Management File. This is a repository of all records, and it relates to the grey filing cabinet in which things are retained. So 1 relates to B. Number 2, the Clinical Safety Case, is the accumulation and organisation of information. This relates to the organised way in which things are retained and stored in a filing cabinet. So number 2 relates to C. Number 3, the Clinical Safety Case Report, is a summary of key information at a key moment in time, relates to an individual item within the filing cabinet. So number 3 relates to A. Think of this as a managed filing system that can be easily audited. The image on the right, the yellow filing cabinet, represents a chaotic filing system, deviating from what is expected and likely to result in a poor safety case. The DCB 0129 and DCB 0160 standards provide a definition of a clinical safety case. The accumulation and organisation of product and business process documentation and supporting evidence through the life cycle of the system. This is similar to case in law. An argument without evidence is unfounded. Building a narrative to describe what has been done by who to ensure that the development and use of health IT system has been risk managed and designed for safety. Evidence without an argument is irrelevant. Evidence shows that identified risk controls, for example, have been implemented and are effective. The clinical safety case builds and evolves during the life of the system through to decommissioning. We can learn as much from the way a safety case argument and evidence is developed as from the data itself. This diagram looks a little deeper into the development of a clinical safety case argument. From the left, moving clockwise, the scope of the argument is the boundary of the clinical safety case, and it must be defined. Functionality or use outside of the scope has not undergone clinical risk management activities and will compromise the integrity and validity of the clinical safety case. The argument must be relevant. The approach is appropriate to the work being done. For example, the test plan includes safety-related test requirements. The clinical risk management activities align with and keep pace with the product lifecycle. The argument is comprehensible. Third parties have got to be able to understand the case being made. Remember your audience. This will include clinical safety officers, but can also include others such as clinical and non-clinical system users, health organisation commissioners, as well as technical staff. A structured argument. This supports comprehension. Applying structure and logic aids understanding and maintenance. A supported argument. The provision of relevant and convincing evidence demonstrate that you have achieved what you have set out to do. It's been effective and that it can be easily audited. We'll come back to evidence later. This diagram shows how aspects of clinical risk management can be structured from health IT system definition, risk strategy, to risk management activities. Standards establish the fundamental requirements of a safety argument. They follow a universal approach to risk management. Set the scope, identify hazards, establish risk against well-defined criteria, and reduced where necessary. If you follow the standards and guidance documents, this will articulate the argument. We still need to provide evidence. This can be either including detail within the safety documentation themselves, or having links and references to evidence such as specific software testing or business process documentation. Now let's take a closer look at the evidence, the essential supporting material for the argument. Again, moving from the left clockwise. Traceable. The evidence must relate to specific elements within the clinical safety case. Generic references to test reports or training materials, for example, are not sufficient. They must be specific. The evidence must be relevant. It needs to be appropriate to the claim being made, for example, to show that a control claimed has been implemented. It must be complete. We must show that work has finished, there are no gaps, and there are no unknowns. The evidence must be verified to show that it achieves what was intended. It has the desired effect in terms of reliability, coverage. For example, to show a claimed control is effective in reducing the risk. The evidence must be available to support each decision point, and throughout the life cycle it must be retrievable for audit or investigation. Remember, an argument without evidence is unfounded. Safety cases and our standards. The aim is to gain confidence in the safety of the health IT system under assessment. Let's start with conformance. This demonstrates we have appropriate processes and people in place and we're following best practice, so adding weight to the risk argument and confidence in reaching the right outcomes. To add further confidence, we need more than just good process. We need evidence that the work has been done is appropriate to convince others. Again, this adds weight to the risk argument. Now finally, The argument of risk mitigation for the health IT system under assessment. This is the story. The clinical context and technical explanation that brings the conformance process and the evidence together so that we can more readily communicate to the stakeholders the work that's been done and the overall risk profile. Together, these three parts form the safety case. Risk and confidence. You can use this table as a guide when reviewing third-party clinical safety case reports to gain confidence or identify areas of concern. Is the health IT system and care pathway accurately described in terms of technical environment and clinical context? Follow a risk management approach to achieving safety. Is the list of identified hazards appropriate and complete? Were appropriate processes and people involved? Is the risk assessment complete? Is the list of causes complete? Do the risk assessments align with the defined criteria and initial risk scores suitable to the circumstances? Have identified controls been implemented? Are the risk reduction techniques and actions effective? Remember the 4 T's: treat, terminate, tolerate and transfer. Is there evidence to support the risk reduction claimed? And finally, evaluation of residual risk. Evaluate residual risk scores. Are they suitable and acceptable to the clinical context? Conformance. Achieving conformance to clinical safety standards does not guarantee safety. Sorry to labour the point here, but there are strengths and weaknesses to conformance. I think it's particularly important to be aware of the weaknesses. Process adherence does not create direct product evidence. One size does not fit all, and it can introduce prescription. The process itself should be under regular review. Be ready to adapt and refine the process where appropriate. Remember to record both the changes and the justification. This could be a change to the central process or a change for a specific project. Conformance can be seen as stifling innovation. There's no doubt that risk management tasks take time and resource. Remember, the depth of the assessment should always be proportionate to the level of risk. Clinical safety case reports. This slide shows the clinical safety standards definition for a clinical safety case report. I'll give you some time to read it. It's a snapshot in time. It evolves as safety-related changes to the system are introduced, or its use in a new clinical context necessitates an updated report. An individual report may not include the whole safety case, just what's relevant at a key stage in their life cycle. For example, a report to support a new release of an existing system may contain only information relevant to the change and to guard against adverse impact upon existing functionality. Therefore, it's important that the correlation between the version of the report and the version of the software it relates to is maintained. The clinical safety officer must approve the document before its release. This slide and the following 2 slides show what DCB 0129 and 160 suggest as content for the clinical safety case report. It's divided into 11 sections with a brief content description for each. By now you'll be familiar with these, so I'll go through these fairly quickly. And remember, the clinical safety team's webpage provides further information. Section 1, the introduction. This may include a summary of all planned project phases and the actual phase this report is supporting, as well as the description of the target audience. Section 2, the system definition. So here, think about the scope definition and the clinical context. Note, we've added medical device assessment and status to section 2. Please refer to the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, for further information about medical device regulations. Section 3, Clinical Risk Management System. This describes the processes to be followed and people responsible for their implementation. If you had this documented elsewhere, you could summarise and provide a reference to it to save repeating this information. Section 4, Clinical Risk Analysis. Describe the hazard identification techniques used, workshops held and people involved. Remember the cause, effect, hazard and harm model presented in Module 5. Section 5, Clinical Risk Evaluation. How serious the patient harm could be and how likely that harm is to occur should a hazardous event occur. Section 6, Clinical Risk Control. What should be done about the risks identified? Remember the 4 T's: terminate, treat, tolerate and transfer. And remember, the level of detail here should be proportionate to the level of risk. Section 7, the hazard log. This is a record of ongoing identification, analysis and resolution of associated hazards. Remember, NHS Digital's safety team webpage has a template for the hazard log. Test issues. This is a review of all outstanding test issues to determine which, if any, could impact on safety. Where there is cause for concern, they need to be assessed and any unacceptable clinical risk must be managed appropriately. Also include a plan for defect resolution. This is sometimes called a work-off plan. A summary safety statement from the Clinical Safety Officer. This will confirm that the clinical risk management activities are completed in accordance with the Clinical Risk Management Plan and supports the acceptability for deployment and use. It should highlight anything of significance to ensure that clear communication is established around specific high-risk hazards, transfer of controls, or outstanding test issues. Quality assurance and document approval. This is to show that you've followed a controlled process for the creation, review, approval, issuance, distribution, and accessibility of your clinical safety documents. Section 11, Configuration Control. Again, this is about following a controlled process to ensure that safety documentation is kept in line with the health IT system, to ensure that there's clear traceability of which safety case report supports which version of the health IT system. This brings us to the end of Module 9, Clinical Safety Case and Clinical Safety Case Report. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Charles Oluwashuko. I'm a lead safety engineer and I'll be taking you through the incident management model. We will be looking at the incident management, and this model aims to provide you with an overview of what the safety standard says about safety incident management, the importance of reactive clinical risk management, and finally the sequence of key activities relating to safety incident management. By the end of the model, you would learn the safety incident management process, the key steps to the effective resolution of a safety incident, and the importance of the safety incident management log. During the clinical risk management process model, both proactive and reactive approaches were discussed. The proactive clinical risk management process considers what could go wrong and ensures clinical safety is considered in the design, development and deployment of the health IT system. The aim being to either prevent the hazard from occurring or reduce the likelihood of harm occurring. We will now be considering the reactive approach, which responds to safety incidents that could occur during live operations or live use of the system. Incident management generally refers to a set of practices, processes, and solutions that enables teams to detect, investigate, and respond to incidents. It is a critical element of businesses of all sizes and a requirement for meeting most data compliance standards and service level agreements. Safety incident management processes ensure that health IT teams can quickly address vulnerabilities and issues. Faster responses help reduce the overall impact of incidents, mitigate the potential of harm to patients, and ensure that systems and services continue to operate as planned. The diagram describes 6 steps to the effective resolution of a safety incident. Step 1. Monitor and detect. This involves observing the in-use characteristics and being able to spot when unsafe events happen. Step 2. Analyze and assess. This is where an assessment is undertaken to determine whether the incident is safety related and an evaluation of the risk profile is conducted. Step 3. Tactical management. In this step, short actions to address the immediate threats to patients are identified. Step 4, which is the root cause analysis, requires a systematic approach of identifying the root causes of the problem or event and the appropriate approach for responding to them. This would need to be done thoroughly and through exhaustive reviews. Step 5. Step 5 involves understanding the impact on the product or health IT system clinical safety case to identify whether it has been undermined or compromised due to the safety incident. Step 6, which is the final step, is the strategic management, where there will be recommendations for the long-term corrective actions. In line with Section 3.6 of the DCB Safety Standards, the requirement provides guidance for the establishment and use of the Incident Management Log to support the effective communication, resolution, and archiving of safety-related incidents. The log should be used throughout the life of a health IT system and serve to provide a common portal to the appropriate staff so that they have an up-to-date view of the status and management of both current and historical safety incidents associated with the health IT system. Section 7.2 of the standards also fosters best practice for organizations to have an established incident management process which is integrated into the organization's wider service management process. The incident management process is to enable users of the health IT system report incidents they have had or incidents which may have an impact on patient safety to the manufacturer. To achieve this, the safety incident management process needs to specify a central point of contact and first line of support, such as a help desk or service desk where the incident is logged. It is the responsibility of the service desk to actively route the incidents to the other level experts in the organization. This will involve having an experience-based triage process where incident managers work closely or are incorporated within the clinical safety team to gain a better awareness of how to deal with clinical safety incidents. There would be an expectation for clinical safety teams to provide service desk staff with tried and tested questions to assist with safety incident identification and triaging. This will all be part of the already established clinical risk management process for the assessment and prioritization of the resolution of safety incidents. The safety standards recommends you have a process of classifying the clinical risk into simple skills such as a low, medium or high in line with the organization's risk matrix. A good safety incident management process should have a clearly defined process for distinguishing safety incidents from general service incidents. Such an established process would equally assist in differentiating between business and patient safety impact. The clinical safety team or the clinical safety officer should have clear accountability for establishing, reviewing, and managing the safety incidents in a timely manner. Having the right tools in place to record and manage safety incidents is vital for your organization. This should include having an established process for regular reviews and updates of the product clinical safety case and hazard log in order to verify the effectiveness of controls and the identification of new hazards as an outcome of a safety incident. As part of the accountability, it is recommended that the clinical safety teams or the clinical safety officer have regular engagement and post-incident reviews are conducted with the service management teams and resolver groups, as such working practice potentially leads to continuous process improvements within the organization. The following parameters are recommended for an effective and efficient safety incident management log. Firstly, a reference number, as this would provide a unique identifier for the organization or the system and would be useful in communicating with the users on the ultimate resolution of the safety incident. The details of the named individual, organization, and contact details of the reporter would also allow feedback to be provided to the user and for the investigating teams to contact if more information is required as part of the root cause analysis. The date the incident was reported and the date of the incident actually occurring needs to be differentiated and recorded in the incident management log. The incident summary provides details of the incident, and the categorization is important in determining how incidents should be handled and for prioritizing response resources. The narrative of the incident could be a direct summary or reports from the affected user's organization and can include any prevailing conditions, causes, and observed effects, including any harm that occurred. If possible, depending on the incident, details of any workaround to mitigate the clinical risk by the user would also need to be documented. Determining the clinical risk by considering the severity of the safety incident, the likelihood of reoccurrence, and known mitigations for relevant hazards does feed into the prioritization of the incident. Details of the functionality system or systems and the releases or versions of the system affected by the incident would help in identifying the users or even third-party suppliers that could be impacted. Having a journal section as part of the log is very useful, as this provides users or resolver groups have real-time details of the investigations conducted to resolve the incident. It allows stakeholders identify any permanent controls introduced to prevent reoccurrence. It is recommended that the journal should provide clarity on who, when, and what updates have been provided for audit purposes. The made safe date should really provide stakeholders with details of when the incident was made safe through the appropriate and agreed tactical management. Summary of the root cause analysis by the resolving teams is very vital for the lessons learned and for ensuring the effectiveness of mitigations. This is also useful in reviewing existing causes of hazards or for the identification of new hazards. Close date. Closing incident typically involves finalizing documentation and evaluating the steps taken during response. This evaluation helps team identify areas of improvement and proactive measures that can help prevent future incidents. In conclusion, the Safety Incident Management Log is a summary of the description, timelines, root cause, record of actions, the risk mitigation tactics used to prevent the type of incident, details of the resolving teams, and resolution.